The city burned for 163 days. By early December of 1942, Stalingrad was no longer a city in any recognizable sense. It was a constellation of burning points in the frozen dark, a skeletal grid of streets that no longer led anywhere, and beneath it all, a living grave where two armies fed themselves into the machinery of annihilation at a rate that defied comprehension. The Sixth Army, under General Feldmarschall Friedrich Paulus, was encircled. Operation Uranus had closed the Soviet pincers on November 23rd, trapping nearly 300,000 German and Axis forces inside a pocket roughly 50 kilometers east to west, 40 north to south. The Luftwaffe had promised resupply. Hermann Göring himself had assured the Führer that his aircraft could deliver 500 tons of material per day. They never came close. On good days, they managed 70. On most days, far less. The steppe in winter is not merely cold, it is a void. Temperatures in early December hovered near -28 degrees Celsius, and the wind came across the open ground with nothing to slow it, no forests, no hills, only the low gray horizon and the snow that moved across it like smoke. The villages northwest of the pocket had been evacuated or emptied by force, their populations scattered or dead, their structures reduced to skeletal frames half buried in drifts. The Germans called this region the Totenland, the land of the dead. Soviet forces called it the approach. It was the corridor through which relief convoys would have to pass if the Sixth Army were to survive the winter. Both sides knew this. Both sides watched it. On the night of December 4th at 2200 hours, Soviet reconnaissance units operating along the northwest perimeter reported unusual vehicular movement. The report came from a forward observation post manned by elements of the 21st Army's 63rd Rifle Division, positioned approximately 18 kilometers from the outer German defensive line. The notation was brief, logged in pencil on moisture-warped paper. Multiple engine sounds, northwest bearing. No visual confirmation. Atmospheric interference suspected. The officer who filed it, a senior lieutenant named Grigory Pavlovich Sokolov, noted that the temperature had dropped sharply after sunset and that ground fog had formed in the low draws and gullies despite the cold, an inversion layer, trapping what little warmth the earth retained beneath a ceiling of frozen air. The sound persisted for 40 minutes. It was described variously as diesel engines, heavy trucks, possibly half-tracks. The cadence was regular, mechanical, but the direction was difficult to fix. At 23:20 hours, Sokolov ordered a reconnaissance patrol forward, 4 men lightly armed, under the command of a sergeant named Dmitry Kuznetsov. They moved on foot, following a frozen cart track that ran through a shallow ravine toward the suspected origin of the sound. The patrol carried no radio. Communication was to be by signal flare if enemy contact occurred. They carried standard issue Mosin Nagant rifles, canvas winter overcoats that were already inadequate, and woolen ushankas pulled low over their ears. Kuznetsov carried a compass and a hand-drawn map marked with Soviet and suspected German positions. The map was 3 weeks old. They returned at 0:25 hours. All 4 men were accounted for, but none of them spoke immediately upon reaching the outpost. Sokolov noted in his log that they appeared shaken, not wounded, not frostbitten, but visibly disturbed. When pressed, Kuznetsov gave his report in fragments. They had followed the sound northwest for approximately 3 kilometers, moving parallel to the suspected route. The fog had thickened as they descended into lower ground dense enough that visibility dropped to less than 10 meters. The temperature, according to Kuznetsov's estimation, had continued to fall. He described the air as thick, almost resistant, and said that frost had begun forming on their eyelashes and the metal components of their rifles within minutes of entering the fog bank. The sound had grown louder. Kuznetsov was certain now it was a convoy. Heavy vehicles, moving in column, their engines laboring against the cold and the terrain. He estimated at least a dozen, possibly more. but they never saw them. At one point, the lead scout, a private named Alexei Ostrovsky, claimed he saw movement through the fog. The vague silhouette of a truck, no lights, passing parallel to their position at a distance of perhaps 30 meters. He did not call out, he did not fire. He said the shape was wrong, the proportions were off. The truck, if that's what it was, seemed too tall, too narrow, and it moved without sound apart from the distant engine noise that continued, unchanging, from somewhere deeper in the fog. Then the wind shifted. The fog lifted for perhaps 10 seconds, maybe less, and Kuznetsov saw the road. It was empty. No tracks in the snow, no exhaust plumes, no convoy. Just the pale, unbroken surface of the steppe under a sky so clear and cold that the stars seemed to hum. And still, faintly, from somewhere to the northwest, the sound of engines continued. They withdrew immediately. Sokolov did not escalate the report. He marked it as inconclusive reconnaissance, possible enemy patrol, no contact. But in the margin, in smaller script, he added a single line, unprompted and unattributed. The locals call it the Frozen March. Sokolov's report reached division headquarters 31 hours after the patrol returned. It traveled through the standard channels, company to battalion to regiment, each level adding its own annotation, each officer weighing whether the information warranted elevation or dismissal. In a conventional engagement, unexplained engine sounds might have triggered an immediate response, but Stalingrad had long since ceased to be conventional. Artillery fell at random, aircraft appeared and vanished without pattern. Entire units were reported destroyed only to reappear days later, having survived in cellars or sewers that no map recorded. The fog of war was literal here, compounded by smoke, cold, and exhaustion that reduced visibility and coherence to fragments. The report landed on the desk of Colonel Anatoly Ivanovich Belov, Divisional Intelligence Officer, at 1400 hours on December 6th. Belov was 41 years old, a career officer who had served in the Winter War against Finland and had learned to recognize the difference between fear and observation. He read Sokolov's account twice, then pulled the regional maps and cross-referenced the location against known German positions and recent Soviet reconnaissance logs. There had been 3 other reports in the past 10 days, all from forward units along the northwest perimeter, all describing similar phenomena. Engine sounds without visual contact, fog in temperatures that should have prohibited it, and in 2 cases, the mention of vehicle shapes that did not conform to known German or Soviet profiles. None of the reports had triggered action. They were filed as atmospheric anomalies, possible enemy deception, or observer fatigue. But Belov noted a pattern. All sightings occurred between 2200 and 0300 hours. All occurred within a 12-kilometer radius of the same geographic point, a frozen supply road that had once connected the villages of Vertyachi and Peskovatka, now deep inside no man's land. The road had not been used since mid-November. Soviet aerial reconnaissance conducted on November 28th had confirmed no German movement along it, and partisans operating in the area had reported it abandoned. Belov brought the matter to Major General Ivan Vasilyevich Galanin, commanding officer of the 63rd Rifle Division, at 1630 hours. Galanin was a pragmatist. He had been in Stalingrad since September and had seen enough to know that unexplained did not mean irrelevant. If the Germans were moving supplies or reinforcements through that corridor undetected, it represented a tactical vulnerability. If they were not, and the reports were genuine atmospheric or equipment phenomena, then understanding them might prevent future misidentification and wasted resources. Either way, confirmation was necessary. Galanin authorized a reconnaissance and force mission. The objective was straightforward: locate the source of the reported sounds, confirm or deny the presence of German forces, and, if possible, capture prisoners or materiel for intelligence assessment. The mission would be conducted by a composite detachment drawn from the division's reconnaissance company, reinforced with a heavy weapons section and a political officer to ensure morale and doctrinal compliance. Command would fall to Senior Lieutenant Sokolov, who had filed the initial report and knew the terrain. Departure was set for 2000 hours on December 7th, allowing one full day for preparation and coordination with adjacent units to prevent friendly fire incidents. The detachment assembled at the divisional staging area on the afternoon of December 7th, 22 men in total. Sokolov led the reconnaissance element, 8 riflemen equipped with Mosin Nagants, 2 PPS-41 submachine gunners, and a scout team of 3 carrying signal flares, compasses, and hand-drawn overlays of suspected German minefields. The heavy weapons section consisted of a Degtyaryov DP-27 light machine gun team, gunner, assistant gunner, and 3 ammunition bearers, commanded by a junior sergeant named Pavel Antonovich Volkov. The political officer was Senior Politruk Boris Mikhailovich Yashin, 34 years old, a former schoolteacher from Voronezh who carried a TT-33 pistol and a leather-bound notebook in which he recorded the ideological fitness of the men under his observation. They were issued additional winter clothing, felt Valenki boots, quilted trousers, and sheepskin-lined jackets that were still insufficient against the cold, but better than the canvas overcoats most units wore. Each man carried 3 days of rations, dried bread, lard, and a small tin of condensed meat, along with 200 rounds of ammunition and 4 RGD-33 stick grenades. Sokolov was given a RGD-1 radio, one of the newer models with a range of approximately 8 kilometers under ideal conditions, though the cold and terrain interference often reduced effectiveness to half that. The radio operator, a young corporal named Viktor Sergeyevich Lebedev, had been trained on the equipment for less than 2 weeks. At 1900 hours, as the sky dimmed to a deep bruised violet and the temperature began its nightly descent, Sokolov gathered the detachment and briefed them on the route and objective. They would move northwest along a series of frozen irrigation ditches and shallow ravines, avoiding the exposed steppe and staying below the horizon line to minimize silhouette visibility. The target area was approximately 14 kilometers from their current position, a march of 4 to 5 hours given the terrain and the need for caution. Once in position, they would establish an observation post and wait. If the sounds recurred, they would investigate. If contact with enemy forces occurred, they would withdraw and report. There was to be no unnecessary engagement. This was reconnaissance, not assault. Yashin added a brief ideological note, reminding the men that they fought not merely for the motherland, but for the future of all working peoples, and that vigilance against fascism required both courage and discipline. The men listened in silence. Most had heard variations of the speech dozens of times. They checked their weapons, adjusted their loads, and waited for the order to move. At 2000 hours, the detachment departed the Soviet lines and headed northwest into the frozen dark. The first 2 hours passed without incident. The detachment moved in a staggered column, maintaining 5-meter intervals between men to minimize exposure to potential shelling or small arms fire. Sokolov led from the front, navigating by compass and the pale wash of starlight that filtered through breaks in the cloud cover. The irrigation ditches were frozen solid, their surfaces ribbed with ice that cracked underfoot despite efforts at silence. The sound carried farther than it should have in the still air, each footfall a percussion note against the vast emptiness of the steppe. Twice Sokolov called a halt, listening for movement or response. There was none. Only the wind, low and persistent, and the occasional distant thump of artillery from the direction of Stalingrad, muted by distance to something almost gentle. At 2200 hours, they reached the first waypoint, the ruins of a collective farm identified on the map as Kolkhoz Krasny Oktyabr, Red October Farm. The designation was optimistic. What remained were three burned-out structures, their timber frames collapsed inward and buried under snow, and a stone well that had been partially demolished, likely by shell fire. Sokolov ordered a 10-minute rest. The men dropped into the snow in pairs, sharing body heat and checking weapons for ice buildup in the actions and barrels. Lebedev, the radio operator, attempted to establish contact with divisional headquarters. The transmission was garbled, interrupted by static and what he described as a low, rhythmic interference, almost like breathing. He logged the attempt and secured the radio. It was here that they encountered the first local. He appeared without warning, emerging from the dark interior of one of the collapsed barns as if he had been waiting. The forward scouts nearly fired before recognizing him as a civilian, an old man, perhaps 70, dressed in layers of wool and fur that might have been scavenged or might have been his own. His face was deeply lined, weathered to the texture of old leather, and his eyes were colorless in the dim light. He spoke in Russian, though his accent was regional, thick with the vowel shifts of the lower Volga. He asked if they were hunting the convoy. Sokolov questioned him carefully. The man identified himself as Pyotr, though he gave no patronymic and no village of origin. He claimed to have lived in the area his entire life, tending livestock and crops that no longer existed. When asked why he had remained after the evacuation, he said simply that the land did not belong to the armies, and he did not belong anywhere else. Sokolov asked what he knew about the sounds, the engines, the convoy. Pyotr nodded slowly, as if the question confirmed something he had already assumed. He said the convoy had been moving through the region since the snows came, not every night, but often enough. Always between the hours when the cold was deepest, when the ground itself seemed to contract and the air turned sharp enough to cut. He had never seen it clearly, he said, but he had heard it many times, and once, from a distance, he had seen shapes moving through the fog. Vehicles, he thought, though their outlines were wrong, stretched and angular in ways that did not match the trucks he remembered from before the war. He said the local people, those few who remained in the scattered hamlets and dugouts, called it the Morozny Caravan, the frozen caravan. They believed it was a remnant, a memory of something that had passed this way long before the Germans or the Soviets, something that moved through the cold because the cold was where it belonged. Yashin, the political officer, interrupted. He asked Pyotr if he believed in ghosts. The old man looked at him for a long moment, then said he believed in what he had seen and heard, and that belief was a luxury for men who had time to argue. Yashin pressed him, asking if he was spreading defeatist superstition, undermining the morale of Soviet soldiers with peasant folklore. Pyotr shrugged. He said the convoy did not care about morale. It moved whether anyone believed in it or not. Sokolov intervened before the exchange could escalate. He asked Pyotr where the convoy had been seen most recently. The old man gestured northwest, toward the frozen supply road that connected Vertyachi and Peskovatka, the same route identified in the divisional intelligence briefing. He said the sounds were loudest there, and that the fog always appeared first in the low ground near the road, rising from nowhere even when the sky was clear. He warned them not to enter the fog directly, not to follow the sounds too closely. He said that men who did sometimes returned, but not always, and those who did were often silent afterward, as if they had forgotten how to speak or had decided there was nothing worth saying. Sokolov thanked him and ordered the detachment to prepare to move. As they assembled, Pyotr called after them. He said there was an old saying from before the revolution, from the time when the steppe was still contested by the nomads and the river traders. The winter takes what it is owed, and it always remembers the debt. He did not elaborate. He turned and disappeared back into the collapsed barn, and when one of the scouts checked the interior 30 seconds later, there was no sign of him. No footprints in the snow inside, no warmth in the air, nothing to indicate he had been there at all. The detachment continued northwest. Sokolov noted the encounter in his log, but did not report it over the radio. Yashin walked beside him for several minutes, then asked quietly if Sokolov believed the old man's story. Sokolov said he believed the old man had been there, and that was enough for now. Yashin did not reply. At 23:45 hours, they reached the edge of the target area. The supply road was visible ahead, a pale scar across the snowfield, and beyond it, in the low ground to the west, a wall of fog was rising, slow and deliberate, as if something beneath the earth were exhaling. The fog was not natural. Sokolov had seen fog before, in every season and terrain, and he understood its behavior. It formed over water, settled in valleys, clung to the warmth of rivers and marshes. It did not rise from frozen ground in the middle of winter, when the temperature sat at minus 30 degrees Celsius and falling. It did not move against the wind, and it did not carry with it the smell that now reached the forward scouts. A sharp, acrid scent, like burned oil mixed with something older, something organic and wrong. At midnight precisely, Sokolov signaled a halt. The detachment dropped into defensive positions along a low ridge that overlooked the supply road and the fog bank beyond. Visibility had deteriorated rapidly. The fog had climbed from the Western Depression and now covered the road entirely, a gray-white mass approximately 3 meters high that stretched north and south as far as they could see. Its upper surface was unnaturally flat, as if pressed down by invisible weight, and it did not dissipate or thin at the edges. It simply stopped, a clean horizontal boundary between the clear air above and the obscured ground below. Sokolov deployed the DP-27 machine gun team on the highest point of the ridge, giving them overlapping fields of fire across the road and the approaches. The riflemen spread out in pairs, forming a loose perimeter with interlocking sectors. Lebedev set up the radio and attempted contact with division headquarters. The transmission went through this time, though the signal was weak and intermittent. Sokolov reported their position and the presence of the fog. Division acknowledged and instructed him to observe but not engage unless directly threatened. Estimated time for the phenomenon, based on previous reports, was between 1 and 3 hours. They were to maintain radio contact at 30-minute intervals. The waiting began. The men lay in the snow, weapons trained on the fog, breath steaming in short, controlled bursts. Minutes stretched. The cold worked its way through the layers of clothing, a persistent ache that started in the extremities and crept inward. Several men shifted position repeatedly, flexing fingers and toes to maintain circulation. Yashin moved along the line, whispering encouragement and doctrinal reminders, though his voice carried an edge of tension that undermined his words. At 00:43 hours, the sound began. It started as a low vibration, felt more than heard, a frequency that seemed to resonate in the chest and the base of the skull. Then it clarified. Engines. Diesel engines, heavy and laboring. The unmistakable growl of trucks under load. The sound came from within the fog, moving from north to south along the line of the road. Sokolov estimated distance at 200 meters, possibly less. The sound grew louder, closer, accompanied now by the creak and groan of suspension systems, the metallic clatter of chains or tracks, and beneath it all, a rhythmic thumping that might have been wheels crossing uneven ground. The forward scout, Ostrovsky, raised his hand and pointed. Movement in the fog. Shapes, dark and indistinct, passing parallel to their position. Sokolov brought up his binoculars, adjusting focus through the dim starlight and the interference of the fog. He could make out silhouettes, vehicles in column moving slowly, perhaps 15 to 20 kilometers per hour. The spacing was regular, military precision, but the profiles were wrong. The trucks were too tall, their cabs elongated vertically in a way that suggested they had been stretched or distorted. The cargo beds were covered, canvas or tarp, but the shapes beneath the coverings were irregular, bulging in places and sunken in others, as if the loads had shifted or settled unevenly. Sokolov counted 12 vehicles before the column passed beyond his line of sight. He noted exhaust plumes from some, but not all, and in 2 cases, he observed what appeared to be frost forming on the rear panels of the trucks, crystallizing outward in patterns that spread like veins. The sound continued for another 4 minutes after the last visible shape disappeared, then faded gradually to silence. The fog remained. At 01:15 hours, Sokolov made the decision to investigate. He selected a 4-man team, himself, Ostrovsky, one of the PPSH submachine gunners named Ilya Petrovich Davidov, and a rifleman named Gennady Fyodorovich Baranov, who had worked as a mechanic before conscription and might be able to identify vehicle types or mechanical details. He instructed Volkov, the heavy weapons sergeant, to assume command of the observation post and to provide covering fire if they encountered resistance. Radio contact would be maintained at 5-minute intervals. If contact was lost for more than 15 minutes, Volkov was to withdraw the detachment and report. Yashin insisted on accompanying them. Sokolov argued briefly, citing the political officer's lack of field experience, but Yashin invoked his authority under the military commissar regulations and said that his presence would ensure accurate ideological assessment of whatever they encountered. Sokolov relented. The team increased to 5. They descended from the ridge at 01:25 hours, moving in single file with weapons at the ready. The approach to the fog was gradual. The ground sloped gently downward, the snow undisturbed except for the tracks of small animals and the wind-sculpted drifts that formed around buried debris. 50 meters from the fog line, the temperature dropped noticeably. Sokolov's exhaled breath hung in the air longer than it should have, and the frost on his weapon began to thicken, crackling faintly as he moved. They entered the fog at 01:32 hours. Visibility collapsed immediately to less than 5 meters. The light from the stars vanished, replaced by a uniform gray luminescence that seemed to come from the fog itself, as if it were faintly phosphorescent. Sound changed as well. The crunch of snow underfoot became muffled, absorbed by the surrounding air, and their voices, when they spoke, sounded flat and directionless. Ostrovsky, leading, reported that his compass was spinning erratically, unable to settle on a bearing. Sokolov ordered them to follow the road by visual reference, staying on the southern edge where the frozen ruts were still faintly visible. They had advanced approximately 100 meters when Baranov, the mechanic, stopped abruptly and signaled for silence. He pointed ahead and to the left. There, half submerged in a snowdrift beside the road, was a truck. It was a German Opel Blitz, a 3-ton cargo vehicle commonly used by Wehrmacht logistics units. The canvas cover over the bed was intact but heavily frosted, and the tires were buried to the axles. The cab doors were closed. No tracks led to or from the vehicle. It appeared to have been there for days, possibly weeks, abandoned and forgotten. Sokolov approached cautiously, Davidov covering him with the PPSH. He reached the driver's side door and tried the handle. It opened without resistance, the hinges silent despite the cold. Inside, the cab was empty. No bodies, no equipment, no personal effects. The seats were covered in a thin layer of ice crystals, and the steering wheel was encased in frost so thick it resembled coral. The dashboard gauges were frozen in place, needles pointing at random readings. The ignition was off. The keys were missing. Baranov examined the engine compartment. The hood was not locked and lifted easily. He reported that the engine block was intact but frozen solid. The coolant crystallized and the oil congealed to a tar-like consistency. There was no sign of mechanical failure, no battle damage, no indication that the vehicle had been deliberately disabled. It simply appeared to have stopped, and whoever had been inside had left without taking anything or leaving any trace of their departure. Yashin asked if the truck was operational. Baranov said it would take hours to thaw and service, assuming they had the tools and fuel, which they did not. Sokolov ordered them to continue. As they moved past the Opel, Ostrovsky glanced back and stopped. He said the truck looked different. Sokolov turned. The vehicle's position had not changed, but its orientation seemed wrong, as if it had rotated slightly on its axis, though no one had touched it, and there were no new tracks in the snow. They pressed on. Within the next 200 meters, they found 3 more vehicles: another Opel Blitz, a Soviet ZIS-5 supply truck, and a German SDKFZ 251 half-track. All were abandoned, all frozen, all positioned along the road as if they had been part of a convoy that had simply ceased to exist mid-transit. None showed signs of combat damage. None had bodies inside or nearby. The half-track's rear hatch was open, swinging slightly in a breeze that none of them could feel. At 02:18 hours, Lebedev reported via radio that the observation post had lost visual contact with the team. The fog had thickened, and they could no longer see the ridge or the road. Sokolov acknowledged and said they would begin withdrawal in 5 minutes. As he spoke, the sound returned. Engines closer this time, directly ahead. And then through the fog, headlights. 2 pale beams cutting through the gray, approaching slowly from the north. Sokolov ordered the team into the ditch on the southern side of the road. They dropped low, weapons trained on the approaching lights. The headlights were not modern, not the focused beams of military vehicles, but the older style, diffuse and yellowed, casting long shadows that moved independently of their source. The engine sound grew louder, but it was wrong. The rhythm was irregular, stuttering, as if the vehicle were struggling against resistance that had nothing to do with terrain or mechanical failure. The truck emerged from the fog at a distance of 30 meters. It was a Soviet Gaz AA, a light cargo truck manufactured in the early 1930s, recognizable by its flat nose and the distinctive curve of its fenders. But the vehicle was impossibly intact. No rust, no battle damage, no wear from years of service. The paint was clean, a dark olive green that looked fresh despite the conditions. The canvas cover over the cargo bed was drawn tight, lashed down with ropes that showed no fraying. The tires, mounted on spoked wheels, rolled smoothly over the frozen road surface without leaving tracks in the snow. Sokolov raised his binoculars. He could see the cab through the windshield. 2 figures sat in the front seats. They wore Soviet uniforms, though the style was outdated, the cut and insignia matching patterns from the early days of the Red Army before the standardizations of the late 1930s. Their faces were visible but indistinct, blurred as if seen through water or poorly focused glass. Neither figure moved. Their hands were on the wheel and the dashboard, frozen in position, but the truck continued forward at a steady pace, as if guided by momentum alone. The Gaz AA passed within 10 meters of their position. Sokolov could hear the engine clearly now, a wet, labored sound, like machinery running underwater. He could see frost spreading across the vehicle's surface in real time, ice crystals forming in spirals, and geometric patterns that should not have occurred naturally. As the truck moved past, he glimpsed the cargo bed. The canvas cover had a tier near the rear, a small opening perhaps 20 centimeters wide. Through it, he saw shapes, not crates or supplies, but forms that might have been human, stacked or arranged in ways that made no anatomical sense, limbs bent at impossible angles, clothing that shifted between German Feldgrau and Soviet khaki, as if the fabric itself could not decide what it had been. Davidov, the submachine gunner, whispered a single word: Mrtveci, the dead. The truck continued south and disappeared into the fog. No one moved. The sound of its engine faded slowly, replaced once again by the oppressive silence that filled the spaces between noise. Ostrovsky was the first to speak. He said they needed to leave immediately, that whatever they were observing was not a German operation or a Soviet resupply run, but something else entirely, something that had no place in any tactical or strategic framework they understood. Yashin, the political officer, ordered him to be silent. He said that panic and superstition were tools of the enemy, designed to undermine morale and discipline, and that there was a rational explanation for what they had seen. Atmospheric phenomena, perhaps. Hallucination induced by cold and fatigue. Ostrovsky turned and looked at him directly, something that would have been insubordination under normal circumstances, and said that Yashin could explain it to the divisional command if he wished, but that he, Ostrovsky, would not remain in the fog to become part of whatever convoy was moving through it. Sokolov intervened. He said they would withdraw as planned, but that they would document everything they had observed and report it accurately, without embellishment or omission. He ordered Lebedev to attempt radio contact with the observation post. Lebedev tried. The radio produced only static, punctuated by bursts of that same rhythmic interference, louder now, almost like voices speaking in a language that had no words, only cadence and tone. As they prepared to move, Baranov, the mechanic, pointed back toward the abandoned vehicles they had passed earlier. The trucks were moving, not on the road, but sinking, descending slowly into the snowdrifts as if the ground beneath them had turned liquid. The Opel Blitz that had been nearest to them was already half submerged, its cab tilted forward at a 45-degree angle, frost pouring off its surfaces like water. Within seconds it was gone, swallowed completely, leaving only a shallow depression that filled with fresh snow almost immediately. The fog thickened. Visibility dropped to less than 2 meters. The temperature continued to fall. Sokolov's thermometer, clipped to his coat, read minus 38 degrees Celsius, a measurement that should have been accompanied by the sharp, brittle clarity of extreme cold. Instead, the air felt dense, humid, as if they were standing in the breath of something vast and unseen. More lights appeared, not from one direction, but from multiple points around them, converging on the road from the north, south, and west. Headlights, dozens of them, moving through the fog in columns that intersected and overlapped without collision. The sound of engines became overwhelming, a cacophony of diesel and gasoline motors, some modern, some ancient, some that produced noises no internal combustion engine should have been capable of making. Sokolov counted at least 40 vehicles, possibly more, all moving toward the same unseen destination. Yashin demanded they stop one of the trucks, that they verify its contents and confirm whether it was a German supply convoy or some form of Soviet operation that had not been disclosed to divisional command. Sokolov refused. He said the mission parameters were observation and reconnaissance, not interdiction, and that they lacked the force and positioning to engage a convoy of unknown composition. Yashin pulled his TT-33 pistol and said that he was invoking his authority as political officer to override Sokolov's tactical judgment. He said they would stop the next vehicle and inspect it, or he would file a report accusing Sokolov of cowardice and dereliction. Before Sokolov could respond, one of the trucks veered off the road and stopped directly in front of them. It was a German Krupp L 3H163, a heavy cargo vehicle, its canvas cover removed to reveal an open bed stacked with wooden crates. The crates were unmarked, bound with steel straps and covered in frost so thick it obscured their dimensions. The truck's engine was running, idling with a low, guttural rumble, but there was no driver visible in the cab. Yashin approached the vehicle, pistol raised. He ordered the driver to exit and identify himself. There was no response. He moved closer, reached the cab, and opened the driver's side door. Inside, the seat was empty, but the steering wheel was turning on its own, adjusting course as if guided by invisible hands. Yashin stepped back, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts that crystallized instantly in the air. He turned to say something to Sokolov, but the words never came. The cargo in the truck bed shifted. The crates moved, sliding forward as if pushed from behind, and from between them, something emerged. It was a figure, human in outline, but wrong in proportion. The limbs were too long, the torso too narrow, and the head was tilted at an angle that no living neck could have supported. It wore a uniform, though whether German or Soviet was impossible to determine. The fabric seemed to flicker between the two, changing with each movement. Its face was pale, bloodless, the skin stretched tight over the skull, and its eyes were open but empty, reflecting no light. The figure stepped down from the truck bed. Its movements were smooth, mechanical, like a puppet guided by wires. It walked toward Yashin, who raised his pistol and fired twice. The shots were deafening in the muffled air of the fog. Both rounds hit center mass. The figure did not stop, did not react, did not bleed. It continued forward until it was less than a meter from Yashin, then reached out with one elongated hand and touched his chest. Yashin screamed. It was a sound unlike anything Sokolov had heard in 3 years of war, raw and primal, stripped of all articulation. He dropped the pistol and staggered backward, clutching at his coat as if trying to pull something off his skin. The figure withdrew its hand and returned to the truck, climbing back into the cargo bed with the same mechanical precision. The vehicle's engine revved once, then the truck pulled back onto the road and rejoined the convoy, disappearing into the fog. Yashin collapsed. Sokolov and Davidov reached him simultaneously. He was conscious but incoherent, speaking in fragments about cold and depth and being pulled under. His pulse was rapid and thready. His skin, where the figure had touched him, was discolored, a spreading bruise that looked like frostbite but progressed too quickly, blackening the tissue beneath his uniform. Sokolov ordered Davidov and Baranov to carry him. They would withdraw immediately, abandoning observation protocol and radio contact if necessary. They moved east, away from the road, attempting to navigate by dead reckoning and the faint gradient of the terrain. The fog pursued them. It did not dissipate or thin but followed, a coherent mass that moved with deliberate intent, closing distance no matter how quickly they ran. Behind them, the convoy sounds continued, growing louder, as if the entire phantom column had turned and was now bearing down on their position. At 0332 hours, they broke through the fog line and emerged into clear air. The observation post was visible ahead, less than 200 meters away. Volkov and the machine gun team saw them and signaled. Sokolov ordered suppressive fire into the fog behind them, not aimed at any specific target, but as a deterrent, a barrier of sound and steel. The DP-27 opened up, firing in controlled bursts, the tracer rounds arcing into the gray wall and disappearing without impact or echo. The detachment reached the ridge at 0347 hours. Behind them, the fog stopped at the precise line where it had begun, as if held back by an invisible boundary. The convoy sounds faded gradually, then ceased entirely. By 0400 hours, the fog was gone, evaporated or withdrawn, leaving the steppe empty and silent under a sky beginning to pale with the approach of dawn. Yashin died at 0523 hours, approximately 90 minutes after contact with the figure. The detachment had carried him back through the pre-dawn cold, moving as quickly as the terrain and his deteriorating condition allowed. By the time they crossed back into Soviet lines, he was no longer speaking coherently. The discoloration on his chest had spread across his entire torso and up his neck, the tissue beneath the skin turning black and rigid as if flash frozen from the inside. His breathing became shallow and irregular, then stopped entirely while they were still 3 kilometers from the divisional aid station. The field surgeon who examined the body at 0600 hours could provide no medical explanation. The tissue damage resembled severe frostbite, but the progression was wrong. Frostbite advanced slowly, over hours or days, and affected extremities first. This had originated at the point of contact and spread inward toward the vital organs in less than 2 hours. The skin was cold to the touch, even in the relative warmth of the aid station, and when the surgeon attempted to open the uniform to examine the wound site more closely, the fabric tore as if it had been stored in sub-zero temperatures for months. Beneath the clothing, the flesh had crystallized, fracturing along the tissue planes like glass. The surgeon wrote, "Cause of death, unknown, possible severe hypothermic injury," on the preliminary report, and recommended that the body be held for further examination by medical specialists at Army level. The recommendation was denied. At 0800 hours, on orders from division headquarters, Yashin's body was placed in a sealed zinc coffin and prepared for immediate transport to a rear area facility that was not identified in the paperwork. The coffin was loaded onto a supply truck at 0915 hours and departed under armed guard. No autopsy was performed. No further medical documentation was filed. Sokolov submitted his after-action report at 1000 hours on December 8th. He wrote it by hand in a clear, measured script, documenting the timeline of events, the composition of the detachment, the environmental conditions, and the observations made during the reconnaissance mission. He described the fog, the abandoned vehicles, the convoy, and the encounter with the figure that had killed Yashin. He did not embellish. He did not interpret. He recorded what he had seen and heard, using the precise, factual language of military reporting, and he included corroborating statements from Ostrovsky, Davidov, Baranov, and Lebedev. The report reached Colonel Belov's desk at 1100 hours. Belov read it twice, then summoned Sokolov to his office. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Belov questioned Sokolov in detail about the sequence of events, the lighting conditions, the state of alertness of the men, and the possibility of misidentification or hallucination. Sokolov answered each question directly and without hesitation. He acknowledged that the phenomena observed defied conventional explanation, but stated that all 5 members of the team had witnessed the same events and had corroborated each other's accounts independently. He said that whether the convoy was a German deception operation, an unknown atmospheric phenomenon, or something else entirely, it represented a threat to Soviet forces operating in the area and warranted further investigation. Belov asked if Sokolov believed the convoy was supernatural. Sokolov said he did not know what it was, only that it existed and that it had killed a Soviet officer. Belov closed the report and told Sokolov that the matter would be elevated to Army-level intelligence for assessment. He instructed Sokolov to speak to no one about the mission, to ensure that the men under his command did the same, and to prepare for a follow-up interview with senior intelligence staff within 48 hours. He said that the official record would reflect the mission as a standard reconnaissance patrol that had encountered unexpected enemy activity and suffered 1 casualty due to exposure. Sokolov asked if the men would receive recognition for their actions. Belov said that recognition was not the priority at this time. The follow-up interview never occurred. At 1400 hours on December 9th, Sokolov received orders transferring him to a rifle company operating in the Stalingrad urban sector, effective immediately. The transfer separated him from the reconnaissance company and placed him in a combat role with no intelligence or observation duties. Ostrovsky, Davidov, Baranov, and Lebedev were similarly reassigned to different units across the division, dispersed so that no 2 members of the original team served together. The dispersal was completed within 72 hours. None of the men were debriefed further. None were called to testify or provide additional statements. On December 10th, a new reconnaissance patrol was dispatched to the same area, this time under the command of a junior lieutenant named Fyodor Vasilievich Orlov, who had no prior knowledge of Sokolov's mission. The patrol consisted of 15 men, equipped with standard reconnaissance gear and a portable radio. They were tasked with confirming or denying the presence of German forces along the Vertyachi-Peskovatka supply road and assessing the viability of the route for future Soviet logistics operations. They departed at 2000 hours and were due to return by 0600 the following morning. They did not return. Radio contact was lost at 23:45 hours, and no distress signal was transmitted. A relief force was dispatched at 0800 on December 11th. They found no trace of the patrol. No bodies, no equipment, no tracks beyond the initial departure point. The relief force reported dense fog in the target area and noted that their compasses had malfunctioned repeatedly, making navigation difficult. They withdrew after 6 hours and recommended that the area be designated as impassable due to atmospheric and terrain hazards. No further reconnaissance missions were authorized for the Vertiachi-Peskovatka corridor. The road was marked on divisional maps as status unknown, avoid unless operationally critical. Soviet forces advancing westward in subsequent weeks bypassed the area entirely, routing supply convoys and reinforcements through alternate corridors to the north and south. German forces, encircled and starving within the Stalingrad pocket, made no attempts to utilize the road for breakout or resupply. The corridor remained empty, a frozen no-man's land that both armies seemed to have agreed, without communication or coordination, to leave alone. Sokolov survived the remainder of the Stalingrad campaign. He fought in the urban ruins through January and into early February, participating in the final reduction of German strongpoints and the surrender of General Feldmarschall Paulus on February 2, 1943. He was wounded twice, both times by shrapnel, and received the Order of the Red Star for actions during the assault on a fortified factory complex. He never spoke publicly about the reconnaissance mission of December 7th. When asked by fellow officers or subordinates about his time in reconnaissance, he said only that he had been reassigned for operational reasons and that the work had been routine. In March of 1943, after the conclusion of the Stalingrad campaign, Sokolov was transferred to the Voronezh front and promoted to captain. He served with distinction through the remainder of the war, participating in operations at Kursk, the liberation of Ukraine, and the final drive into Germany. He was demobilized in 1946 with the rank of major and returned to civilian life in Leningrad, where he worked as an engineer in a machine-building plant until his retirement in 1971. He died in 1983 at the age of 64 of natural causes. His wartime records, including the after-action report from December 8, 1942, were classified and sealed in the Central Archives of the Ministry of Defense. They remained sealed for 52 years. The files were declassified as part of a broader initiative following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Thousands of wartime documents, many of them fragmentary or incomplete, were released to researchers and historians seeking to reconstruct the operational details of the Eastern Front. Most contained routine intelligence reports, casualty lists, supply requisitions, and after-action summaries that added incremental detail to narratives already well established. Some documents, however, resisted easy categorization. They were anomalies, reports that recorded events outside the expected parameters of conventional warfare, filed by officers whose credibility was otherwise unimpeachable and corroborated by multiple witnesses whose accounts aligned too precisely to be dismissed as fabrication or mass hallucination. Sokolov's report was discovered in a subsection of the 21st Army's reconnaissance files, misfiled under administrative correspondence rather than operational intelligence. It had been marked with a red diagonal stripe, a designation used during the war to indicate documents that required special handling or higher-level review. No such review appeared in the archive record. The report had simply been isolated, separated from the main operational chronology, and left to age in storage for 5 decades. When it was finally digitized and cataloged in the summer of 1994, it drew the attention of a junior archivist named Yevgeny Alexeyevich Volkov, no relation to the heavy weapons sergeant from the original detachment. Volkov cross-referenced the report against other documents from the same time period and location. He found references to the transfer orders for Sokolov and the other team members, the casualty record for Senior Politruk Yashin, listing cause of death as exposure and hypothermia, and a brief notation in the divisional daily log for December 11, 1942, recording the disappearance of Junior Lieutenant Orloff's patrol. He also found something older, predating the war by decades, a regional folklore study compiled in 1927 by an ethnographer named Klavdia Ivanovna Sokolova, who had documented oral traditions and superstitions among the rural populations along the lower Volga. The study included a section on what Sokolova called procession myths, recurring stories of phantom groups usually traveling at night that appeared during periods of extreme cold or hardship. The most persistent of these was the Morozny caravan, the frozen caravan, described by multiple villages across the region in remarkably consistent terms. According to the accounts Sokolova recorded, the caravan had been seen for generations, perhaps centuries, moving along the old trade routes that connected the steppe settlements. It appeared only in the deepest winter, when the cold was so severe that it seemed to crack the air itself, and it was said to carry the dead. Not the recently dead, but those who had been claimed by the steppe over years and decades, travelers and soldiers and merchants who had perished in the snow and whose bodies had never been recovered or properly buried. The folklore held that the caravan was a collection, a gathering. It moved through the winter landscape not randomly, but with purpose, following routes where death had occurred in large numbers, places where the boundary between the living and the dead had been worn thin by accumulated loss. Those who saw it were advised to turn away, to close their eyes and ears, and to avoid any interaction. Those who approached it, who tried to stop it or join it, were said to be taken. They did not die immediately. They continued for a time, walking and speaking, but they were no longer entirely present. The cold had claimed them from the inside, and eventually they simply stopped, frozen in place wherever they happened to be, and the caravan would return to collect them. Sokolova had noted that the stories intensified during periods of famine or conflict when the death toll in the region spiked and the number of unburied bodies increased. The caravan, according to the oral tradition, grew with the number of the unclaimed dead. It was not malicious, not in the way a predator is malicious. It was simply performing a function, completing a task that the living had left unfinished. The winter, the stories said, always took what it was owed. Volkov attempted to trace the origins of the folklore further back, consulting historical records from the 19th century and earlier. He found scattered references in the writings of Cossack chroniclers and Orthodox clergymen stationed in the region during the expansion of the Russian Empire. One account, dated 1798, described a winter of such severity that entire villages were abandoned, their populations either dead or fled, and travelers reported seeing columns of the lost moving across the frozen rivers and steppes, vehicles and figures that appeared to be from different eras, different times, all converging on routes that had been used for centuries to transport goods and people across the desolate interior. The steppe, the account noted, did not forget. It remembered every caravan that had perished in the cold, every merchant train that had been caught by blizzards, every military column that had frozen in place during retreat or advance. And, in the deepest winter, when the cold reached the threshold that it had reached so many times before, those memories became visible, tangible, moving through the landscape as if the passage of time had folded back on itself, and all the dead journeys were occurring simultaneously. Volkov compiled his findings into a research paper titled Atmospheric Phenomena and Folkloric Resonance in Wartime Reconnaissance Reports, The Case of the 63rd Rifle Division, December 1942. He submitted it to a historical journal specializing in Eastern Front studies. The paper was rejected. The reviewers acknowledged the quality of the archival work, but noted that the conclusions strayed too far into speculative territory and that the inclusion of folklore as explanatory framework undermined the academic rigor of the analysis. They suggested he reframe the report as an example of psychological stress affecting frontline troops or as evidence of German deception operations that had not been previously documented. Volkov did not resubmit. He archived his notes and moved on to other projects. The paper was never published in any formal capacity, though it circulated informally among a small group of researchers interested in anomalous wartime incidents. Sokolov's report, along with the supporting documents, remained in the public archive, accessible to anyone with the patience to search for it. In the winter of 2001, a team of documentary filmmakers traveled to the Volgograd region to investigate sites associated with the Battle of Stalingrad. They interviewed local residents, many of them elderly, who remembered the war years either as children or through stories passed down by their parents and grandparents. One woman, aged 83, mentioned that her grandmother had spoken of a road northwest of the city that no one used during the coldest months, a road where vehicles and travelers disappeared without explanation. The grandmother had called it the road that remembers. The filmmakers asked if the woman believed the story. She said she did not know if she believed it, but she knew that the road was still there, and that people still avoided it in winter, not because they had been told to, but because something in the landscape itself suggested that it was better left alone. The Vertiachi-Peskovatka supply road exists today as a deteriorating dirt track, barely passable even in summer, overgrown with weeds and marked by deep ruts that flood during the spring thaw. No memorial marks the location. No sign indicates that anything of historical significance occurred there. The villages it once connected are gone, their populations scattered or extinct, their structures reduced to rubble and covered by decades of snow and soil. The steppe has reclaimed the corridor, and the land looks as it must have looked for centuries before the war, empty and silent under a sky that stretches unbroken to every horizon. Local drivers, when asked, will sometimes say that the road is unlucky. They will not elaborate. They will simply choose alternate routes, adding kilometers and hours to their journeys rather than pass through the area after dark, especially in winter. When pressed, some will say that the road is too cold, that it holds the cold longer than other places, and that vehicles that stop there have trouble starting again. Others will say nothing at all, only shaking their heads and changing the subject, as if speaking about the road too directly might draw attention that is better left unattracted. On clear winter nights, when the temperature drops below -30 and the sky is sharp enough to make the stars ache, there are still reports. Not frequent, not widely publicized, but persistent. Truck drivers on the regional highways to the north and south sometimes mention seeing lights moving across the empty steppe, parallel to the road, but not on it, moving in columns that do not correspond to any known traffic pattern. The lights are always distant, always faint, and they disappear when approached or when the observer stops to investigate. Local police, when such reports are filed, note them and take no action. They have learned, through experience or inherited caution, that some phenomena are best left unconfirmed. The dead of Stalingrad number in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps over 1 million when civilian casualties are included. Many were never identified. Many were never buried. Their remains lie beneath the foundations of the rebuilt city, scattered across the steppe, or dissolved entirely into the soil and the rivers. The war ended in 1945, but the city burned for 163 days, and the cold that winter reached depths that had not been recorded in living memory. The steppe remembers. It always has. And in the deepest cold, when the air itself seems to fracture and the horizon blurs between the living world and something older, the caravan moves. It has always moved. It will move again. The winter takes what it is owed, and it never forgets the debt